I thought I'd found the ultimate sovereign sanctuary, a 3/4-acre outlot with a timber-framed workshop that smelled of 50 years of cedar and independence. But after one neighborly signature over a gift basket of artisanal crackers, I've woken up in a legal hellscape run by a predatory HOA president who's been waiting 20 years for the previous owner to die so she could finally claim my dirt. Now I'm staring down a demolition notice for the very shop I bought this place for. All because I didn't notice the 6-point font on a directory form that actually annexed my soul to a suburban cult. I'm digging through a dead man's hidden archive of cease and desist letters, uncovering a multi-million-dollar secret buried right beneath my floorboards that could bankrupt this entire community. Stick around, because I'm about to turn my table saw on the Oak Creek Estates, and I'm going to prove that when you trick a woodworker, you're dealing with someone who knows exactly how to handle a splinter. My name is Brian Johnson, a man who spent 15 years in a gray cubicle dreaming of the one thing money usually can't buy: sovereign dirt. I poured every cent of my life savings into the Miller place for that timber-framed workshop out back, a sanctuary where the only law is the grain of the wood and the sharpness of my chisel. I'm not just fighting a predatory HOA to save a building. I'm defending the legacy of the old man who held this line for 20 years, and I'll be damned if I let a fraudulent signature turn my sanctuary into a suburban sacrifice. Thanks for listening to my story, and if you like it, a like and subscribe would really help me get stories like this out to all of you. I didn't just shake her hand. I wiped the sawdust off mine first, a habit of respect for the wood that I hadn't yet learned to withhold from people. "Mandy Summers," she chirped, the name landing with the practiced bounce of a local news anchor. "President of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. I saw the moving truck last week and just couldn't let another day go by without properly welcoming our newest addition to the family." She held out the basket. It was heavy, packed with artisanal crackers, a jar of local honey, and a lavender-scented candle that fought a losing battle against the masculine musk of my garage. I took it, feeling the weight of the social obligation she'd just handed me. "Brian Johnson," I said. "Thanks, Mandy. That's really neighborly of you." Her eyes drifted past my shoulder, peering into the open bay of the workshop. I watched her pupils contract as they took in the shelves of reclaimed timber, the industrial dust extractor, and the half-restored drill press that looked like a piece of Cold War artillery. Her smile didn't falter, but it tightened, like a drawstring being pulled shut. "My," she breathed, her voice dropping an octave. "That is quite a hobby you have there, Brian. A bit loud, I imagine? We do so value our quiet hours here in the creek. We like to say the only thing you should hear on a Saturday afternoon is the sound of a sprinkler." "I try to keep the door shut when I'm running the planer," I replied, feeling a sudden defensive prickle. "And I don't usually work past 8. Old man Miller never seemed to have any complaints from the neighbors." Mandy's laugh was a sharp, dry sound, like a branch snapping in the cold. "Oh, Mr. Miller, he was a character, a very firm believer in his own ways. But as they say, seasons change. And we're so excited to have someone younger, someone more community-minded, taking over the reins of this lovely lot." She reached into a side pocket of the basket and pulled out a slim, laminated folder. "I won't keep you from your projects, but I do need a tiny bit of help. We're updating the neighborhood directory. It's how we coordinate the holiday light tour, and more importantly, how we send out emergency alerts for things like water main breaks or roaming coyotes. Plus, it's the only way to get your activated key card for the community pool and the tennis courts." She flipped to the back page of the folder, where a few lines were waiting for a signature. "It's all totally voluntary, of course. Just a formal hello, so the board knows who's moved in. Most folks find the pool access alone is worth the 30 seconds it takes to sign." I looked at the pen she offered, a heavy, gold-plated thing that looked like it belonged on a treaty signing table. I glanced at the page. It looked like a standard contact form: name, phone, email, signature. "Voluntary, you said?" I asked, my hand hovering. Absolutely, she purred, her gaze fixed on my hand. We're a family here, Brian. We don't force anyone to be our friend. But wouldn't it be nice to know your neighbors have your back? I thought about the heat of the upcoming July and the idea of a cold pool after a long day of sanding. I thought about being the good guy on the block, the one who didn't start his residency by being the difficult hermit. I pressed the pen to the paper and scribbled my name, the ink flowing smooth and black. There you go, I said, handing it back. Consider me welcomed. Mandy tucked the folder under her arm with a speed that was almost predatory. Her smile finally reached her eyes, but it wasn't warmth I saw there. It was the cold, hard glint of a hunter who had finally closed a 20-year-old trap. Perfect, she whispered. I'll get this filed right away. Welcome to the Oak Creek Estates, Brian. I think you're going to find that things are going to be very orderly from now on. As she backed down the driveway, her Lexus purring like a satisfied cat, I stood there with my lavender candle and my artisanal crackers, watching her go. I felt a strange chill, despite the afternoon sun. I turned back to my workshop, the sanctuary that felt just a little less private than it had 10 minutes ago. I didn't know yet that the emergency directory had a 6-point font footer on the back of the page I hadn't turned over. I didn't know that I had just signed away the right to the very air I was breathing. The artisanal crackers tasted like cardboard, and the lavender candle sat unlit on a workbench. But for the next few days, I was too busy to care. I spent my evenings in a state of creative euphoria, finally mounting my grandmother's old woodworking vise to the oak bench and surfacing a magnificent slab of curly maple I'd been saving for a special occasion. I felt like a king in a sawdust crown. That Wednesday, the first gift from the association arrived. It wasn't a basket this time. It was a heavy, cream-colored envelope sitting in my mailbox, looking official and ominous. Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Notice of non-compliance. My hands, still stained with walnut oil, shook slightly as I tore it open. Dear Mr. Johnson, welcome to the community. As a member of the Oak Creek Estates HOA, you are required to adhere to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CCNRs, recorded in the county land records. Upon a recent inspection of the neighborhood, it has been noted that the accessory structure, workshop, located at the rear of your property is in direct violation of Article 4, Section 3, Aesthetics and Architectural Harmony. I stopped breathing. My eyes skipped to the bottom of the page. Corrective action required. The structure must be dismantled or removed within 30 days of this notice. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $100 per day, accruing as a lien against the property. I felt like I'd been punched in the solar plexus. I stumbled back to the workshop, the very building they were threatening, and slumped onto my stool. I looked at the signature on the bottom. Mandy Summers, President. Member? I whispered to the empty room. I'm not a member. I scrambled for the welcome folder she'd left behind. I'd tossed it onto a shelf near the sharpening stones. I flipped to the back of the directory form I'd signed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw it. The trap door. In tiny gray 6-point font buried under a paragraph about pool safety was a single sentence. By signing this directory, the undersigned homeowner voluntarily requests annexation into the Oak Creek Estates HOA and agrees to be bound by all recorded CC and Rs, effectively encumbering the title of the property at the address provided. She'd done it. She hadn't just invited me to a pool party, she'd used a directory to perform a property interest transfer under false pretenses. She had waited for Miller to die, waited for the harried executors to leave, and then pounced on the new guy with a smile and a gift basket. I looked around at the timber frames, the windows I'd spent all Saturday cleaning, and the tools that were my only real inheritance. They wanted me to tear it down. They wanted to erase the one thing that made this dirt worth owning. Not today, Mandy, I growled, the words feeling familiar even as I said them. I stood up and started pacing. I remembered what the executor said, that Miller was a hermit who kept to himself. But a man like Miller doesn't survive 20 years of Mandy Summers by just hiding. He survives by fighting. I grabbed a crowbar and headed to the back wall near the heavy cast iron lathe. There was a section of pegboard that didn't quite sit flush with the studs, a spot Miller had always kept covered with an old grease-stained calendar from 1994. I ripped the pegboard away with a groan of protesting nails. There, tucked into the hollow space between the studs, was a thick plastic-wrapped bundle of yellowing envelopes. My breath hitched. This was the archive. This was the history of the war I'd just been conscripted into. I pulled the first envelope out. It was a cease and desist from the HOA, dated June 12, 1998. On the back, in thick, blunt Carpenter's pencil, was a note that made me smile for the first time since opening that letter. Mandy called the cops today because the planer was too loud. Told him to check the 1950s outlot map. I don't belong to her, and neither does my noise. Go to hell, Mandy. I realized then that I wasn't just a woodworker anymore. I was a soldier in a 20-year trench war, and Miller had just handed me the blueprints for the defense. Sleep didn't come. I spent the night huddled over Miller's workbench, the glow of a single shop light illuminating the paper trail of a 20-year siege. By 3 a.m., the workshop felt less like a hobby space and more like a command center. The letters were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mandy hadn't just been annoying, she had been a predator. Every few years, like clockwork, she'd send a new welcome packet, a new directory form, or a community safety survey. Each one had been a thinly veiled attempt to get Miller's signature on an annexation clause. Each one had been returned by the old man with increasingly creative profanity scrawled across the front. "She's been circling this dirt since the 80s, I whispered, my voice raspy from the dust and the adrenaline. I found a letter dated August 2004. Mandy had tried to sue Miller for visual pollution, claiming his woodpile was attracting vermin. Miller's response was a photocopy of the original 1950s plat map. He'd highlighted his lot in neon orange. Attached was a note. "Check the meets and bounds, Mandy. This is an outlot. I'm not in your sandbox. Stop playing with my toys." That was the aha moment. In the U.S. legal system, a plat map is the DNA of a neighborhood. If the original developers didn't include a specific piece of land in the Declaration of Covenants, that land is sovereign. It doesn't matter how many fences you share. If the deed doesn't say HOA, the HOA doesn't exist. At 8:30 a.m., I was the first person through the doors of the county recorder's office. I felt like a man walking toward a gunfight with a briefcase full of evidence. The clerk, a woman who looked like she'd seen 1,000 property disputes, pulled the microfiche for my address. "Here it is," she said, her finger tracing the lines. "Lot 42, 43, 44, and then your property. It's marked as Outlot A, Agricultural Residential. It was part of the original farmhouse before the subdivision was built in '82. "So it's not part of the Oak Creek Estates Declaration?" I asked, my heart hammering. "Nope, it's never been formally annexed." She paused, her brow furrowing as she scrolled down the digital record. "Wait, that's strange. There was a notice of voluntary annexation filed yesterday afternoon." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Yesterday? Signed by the property owner, Brian Johnson," she read, turning the screen toward me. There it was. My signature from the directory form, scanned and attached to a formal legal filing. Mandy hadn't just sent me a mean letter. She had rushed to the courthouse the moment she got my autograph. She had used my own hand to poison my deed. "Is this legal?" I choked out. "I was told this was a neighborhood directory. I was lied to." The clerk gave me a look of genuine pity. "In this county, a signature on an annexation form is a vested interest. If you want to fight it, you're looking at a slander of title suit. You'd have to prove she used deceptive techniques to get you to sign." I walked out of the office and stood on the sidewalk, the morning sun feeling cold on my skin. She had performed a property interest transfer under false pretenses. She had used the recruitment to hell strategy to steal the sovereignty Miller had spent 20 years defending. I drove home, but I didn't go into the house. I went straight to the workshop. I picked up a heavy mallet, feeling its weight in my hand. For a second, I wanted to smash something, anything. Then I saw the unfinished oak bench Miller had started. It was waiting for me. "Not today, Mandy," I said, my voice steady now. I didn't need a mallet. I needed a quiet title specialist. And I needed to find out why Mandy was so obsessed with this specific piece of dirt. Was it just aesthetics, or was there something under my workshop that she wanted even more than the silence? I didn't go to Mandy's house. I'd learned enough from Miller's letters to know that confronting a snake only gets you bitten. Instead, I spent the afternoon on the phone, tracking down a name I'd seen in a local legal journal, Elias Thorne. The article was titled, "Dismantling the Deed, High-Stakes Property Litigation." The receptionist told me he was busy, but when I mentioned the words fraudulent annexation and Oak Creek Estates, the line went silent for a second before Thorne himself picked up. "Brian Johnson?" His voice was deep, gravelly, sounding like a man who spent his weekends crushing rocks just for the sport of it. "I know Mandy Summers. She's been trying to clean up that outlot since the Clinton administration. Did she get your autograph?" "She told me it was a neighborhood directory," I said, my grip tightening on the receiver. "Classic," Thorne grunted. "In the legal world, we call that fraud in the inducement. She used a material misrepresentation of fact to get you to sign a document that fundamentally altered your property rights. If she's already filed it at the county recorders, she's committed slander of title. Congratulations, Brian, you're officially in a war." He told me to meet him the next morning, but that night, I couldn't sit still. I went back to the workshop. The yellowed envelopes spread across the workbench like battle maps. I started digging deeper into the stash I'd found behind the pegboard. I wasn't just looking for legal loopholes anymore. I was looking for the motive. Why was a woman with a $20 million mansion so obsessed with a dusty woodshop on a 3/4-acre outlot? I found a manila folder at the very bottom of the pile, dated 2012. It wasn't a letter from Mandy. It was a set of surveyor's blueprints Miller had commissioned. My breath hitched as I traced the red lines. The HOA had built a community nature trail and a sophisticated drainage system 10 years ago. Looking at the overlay, it was clear. A significant portion of the HOA's multi-million-dollar drainage infrastructure, the pipes that kept Mandy's precious basement dry, was illegally sitting on my land. "She doesn't want the workshop gone because it's ugly," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "She wants the workshop gone so she can annex the land and legitimize the fact that the HOA is trespassing. If the land remained sovereign and Miller or I ever found out about the pipes, we could sue the HOA for inverse condemnation or force them to dig up half the neighborhood to move the drainage. By tricking me into the HOA, she wasn't just beautifying the street. She was performing a property interest transfer to cover up a decades-old corporate theft. The next morning, I walked into Thorne's office. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a retired linebacker in a bespoke suit. I laid the surveyor's maps on his desk alongside the welcome packet and the letters. "She's been hiding a massive liability," I said. "If I'm in the HOA, I can't sue them for the pipes on my own land without suing myself. If I'm out, I can shut down their entire drainage system." Thorne leaned back, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. "This isn't just about a workshop anymore, Brian. This is about punitive damages. She lied to you to protect the board from a multi-million-dollar trespass suit. That's not just a neighborly dispute, that's racketeering." "What's the move?" I asked. "We don't just sue to get you out," Thorne said, standing up and grabbing his coat. "We file a quiet title action to scrub the deed, and then we file a preliminary injunction to stop them from touching a single splinter of that shop. And then," he paused, his eyes gleaming, We send a letter to every homeowner in Oak Creek Estates letting them know their president just put the entire association's bank account at risk to cover her own tracks. Thorne didn't waste time. By Monday morning, he had filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, a legal freeze that barred the HOA from touching my workshop until a judge could untangle the mess. But the real heavy lifting happened in the discovery phase. In the U.S. legal system, discovery is where the polite masks of a suburban war finally get ripped off. Thorne served Mandy and the HOA board with a subpoena deuces tecum, a fancy way of saying, hand over every email, text, and memo you've ever written about the Miller outlot, or go to jail. While Thorne's team was digitizing the board's secrets, I was back in the workshop, doing some discovery of my own. Armed with Miller's old blueprints and a hired ground-penetrating radar, I spent the weekend tracing the red lines across my backyard. The machine started chirping near the edge of the shop's foundation. Here we go, I muttered, the sweat stinging my eyes. Just 18 inches below the surface, the HOA's main stormwater artery, a massive 30-inch concrete pipe, was cutting a jagged path right through the middle of my sovereign dirt. It was a blatant physical trespass. Mandy hadn't just built a trail, she had buried the neighborhood's dirty laundry under my workbench. If that pipe ever burst, my workshop would become a sinkhole, and because she'd recruited me into the HOA, she'd already ensured the cost of the repair would be shared by me, not the association's insurance. On Thursday, Thorne called me into his office. He looked like he'd just won the lottery, but his eyes were cold. "We got the emails, Brian. It's worse than we thought," he said, sliding a printed thread across the mahogany desk. It was an email from Mandy to the board's treasurer, dated 3 days before Miller's funeral. "The old man is finally out of the way," it read. "The inheritors are idiots. They just want the payout. We need to pounce on the new buyer the second he unloads the truck. If we don't get that annexation signature within 30 days, the new title search might catch the drainage encroachment. I'll bring the welcome packet. One signature, and the trespass disappears into the CC&Rs. We'll cite aesthetics to force him to tear down the shop so we can access the pipes for the upcoming upgrades without him ever knowing why." My blood turned to ice. It was a documented conspiracy. She hadn't just lied to get a signature. She had performed a property interest transfer to hide a multi-million-dollar liability and planned to destroy my life's passion to cover her tracks. This was fraudulent concealment and slander of title with a clear paper trail of malice. "She's not just a Karen, Brian," Thorne said, leaning in. "She's an embezzler. She used HOA funds to build that drainage system on land she knew the association didn't own. If the homeowners find out she's put the entire neighborhood's solvency at risk to protect her basement from flooding, they'll do more than just fire her. They'll sue her for every cent she has." "What's the move?" I asked, my voice steady. "We don't wait for the court date," Thorne said, grabbing his briefcase. "We're going to the monthly HOA meeting tonight. We're going to show them the map, show them the emails, and offer them a choice. They can dissolve the HOA and let you go back to being sovereign, or we file a class action on behalf of every homeowner she's lied to." The Oak Creek Estates Community Center smelled of floor wax and expensive perfume, a stifling combination that felt like a chokehold compared to the open air of my workshop. As Thorne and I walked in, the room was already humming with the low-stakes drama of suburban governance, complaints about a loose curbstone on Maple Drive, and a heated debate over the wattage of the new street lamps. Mandy sat at the center of the long dais, her gavel resting beside a pristine bottle of mineral water. She looked every bit the queen of her domain, nodding with practiced empathy at a resident's concerns. Then her eyes hit mine. I saw the micro-adjustment in her posture. The welcome basket smile didn't appear this time. Instead, her jaw set into a hard defensive line. She knew Thorne, and she knew the folder he was carrying. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone cutting through the chatter. "This is a closed meeting for members in good standing. Since you are currently in active violation of the CC&Rs and have filed a frivolous lawsuit against this board, I must ask you to leave." Thorne didn't even slow down. He dropped his briefcase on the front table with a heavy thud that silenced the room. Actually, Madam President, we're here to discuss a matter of sovereignty and disclosure. Or should we call it what it really is? Fraudulent inducement. A murmur rippled through the rows of folding chairs. Neighbors I'd only seen through my windshield, people Mandy had spent years grooming, turned to look at me. "I'm Brian Johnson," I said, stepping forward. I didn't need a microphone. My voice carried with the resonance of a man who spent his life shouting over the hum of a table saw. "And I'm here because your president lied to me to get my signature. But more importantly, she lied to all of you." I pulled out the enlarged surveyor's map and propped it up against the podium. "This is my lot. Outlot A. According to the original 1982 plat, it's not part of this HOA. But 10 years ago, Mandy authorized the construction of the neighborhood's main storm drainage system. She built it right through the middle of my backyard." I pointed to the red line cutting through my workshop's footprint. She knew the HOA was trespassing. She knew that if the owner of this lot ever found out, the association would be liable for millions in damages and relocation costs. So she waited. She waited for old man Miller to die, and then she pounced on me with a welcome directory that was actually a trap to annex my land and legalize her theft. Mandy slammed her gavel. "This is outrageous. These are the delusional ramblings of a man who refuses to follow community standards." "Is it delusional, Mandy?" Thorne asked, pulling a single sheet of paper from his folder. "Because your own emails say otherwise." He handed me the Vulture email. I didn't just read it, I performed it. I read the part about the inheritors being idiots and the plan to force the teardown of my workshop just to access the illegal pipes. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at the treasurer, a man named Henderson who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. I looked at the families who had been paying $200 a month to a woman who had just gambled their entire community's solvency on a lie. "You've used their dues to pay for a legal war against a sovereign neighbor to cover your own tracks," I said, looking Mandy dead in the eye. "You've breached your fiduciary duty to every person in this room. And because you did it with malice, we're asking the court to pierce the corporate veil. You aren't just hiding behind the HOA's bank account anymore, Mandy. You're personally on the hook for every cent of this." Mandy reached for her water, her hand trembling so violently the bottle rattled against the table. The recruitment to hell had officially reversed course. The board members beside her began to physically slide their chairs away, leaving her isolated at the center of the stage. "We're offering a settlement tonight," Thorne announced to the room. "Mr. Johnson's property is de-annexed immediately. The HOA pays his legal fees and a settlement for slander of title. In exchange, he'll grant a formal easement for the pipes, so you don't have to dig up the whole street." "And if we don't?" Henderson, the treasurer, squeaked. "Then we file the class action," Thorne smiled. "And we start by asking why the president's basement is the only one in the neighborhood that has never flooded." I didn't wait for the vote. I didn't need to see the sweat on Mandy's upper lip or the way the other board members were whispering behind their hands like kids in a principal's office. I turned my back on the dais and walked out of the community center, Thorne trailing behind me with the satisfied gait of a wolf who had just finished a meal. "They'll fold, Brian," Thorne said as we hit the cool night air of the car park. "They have no choice. If they go to trial, the discovery alone will bankrupt the association. Henderson is a numbers guy. He's already calculating the cost of a derivative action against Mandy to recover the legal fees she's wasted. She's officially a liability." I drove home in a strange sort of silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I just wanted to hear the wind. When I pulled into my driveway, the Lexus was gone from the street, and for the first time since I'd moved in, the neighborhood felt quiet. Not the artificial quiet hours quiet that Mandy enforced with a stopwatch, but a genuine, peaceful stillness. I went straight to the workshop. I flipped the heavy industrial switch, and the overhead floor scents hummed to life, flickering for a second before bathing the timber frames in a warm, honest glow. I picked up a hand plane and ran it along the edge of the oak bench Miller had started. A long, curling ribbon of wood peeled away, smelling of earth and history. "We're almost there, Miller," I whispered. The next morning, the Karen made one last appearance, but the fire was gone. I was out in the yard, marking the spot where the illegal pipes sat beneath my grass, when Mandy's SUV crawled past. She didn't stop. She didn't smile. She looked older, her face drawn and tight. She'd been stripped of her gavel, and word had already spread through the Oak Creek Facebook group. The president was under investigation for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. By noon, a courier arrived with a package that felt like a trophy. It was a settlement agreement and release. Item 1, immediate de-annexation of Outlot A. Item 2, the HOA admits the signature was obtained via fraudulent inducement and agrees to strike the record. Item 3, a check for my full legal fees plus $15,000 in statutory damages for slander of title. Item 4, in exchange, I grant a limited easement for the existing pipes, provided the HOA pays for a hardening project to protect my workshop's foundation. I took the pen, my own cheap, reliable Bic, not her gold-plated trap, and signed. I felt the recruitment to hell officially dissolve. I was no longer a member. I was a neighbor again. A sovereign, independent neighbor with a very expensive drainage pipe running through his yard that the HOA was now legally required to maintain at their own expense. I spent the rest of the day finishing the oak bench. I sanded the grain until it felt like silk, then applied a coat of linseed oil that made the wood sing. It was a masterpiece of non-conforming aesthetics. As the sun set, I sat on that bench in the middle of my shop looking out at the manicured lawns of Oak Creek. I was the island in their stream again, but this time I knew exactly how deep the water went. The court order arrived on a Tuesday, stamped with the heavy, satisfying seal of the County Superior Court. It was a declaratory judgment, and it was beautiful. It didn't just say I was right. It used words like unconscionable, bad faith, and fraudulent. The judge had ordered the county recorder to strike the annexation notice from my deed with a literal red line, effectively performing a digital exorcism on my property title. I was officially scrubbed. I took a copy of the decree, framed it in a simple piece of scrap cherry wood from my off-cut pile, and hung it right next to the workshop door. It was my new "No Trespassing" sign, written in the language of the High Court. But the real fallout was happening across the fence line. The Oak Creek Estates Facebook group had turned into a digital French Revolution. Now that the vulture email was public knowledge, every homeowner in the neighborhood realized they were living in a financial house of cards. Mandy's great neighborhood was actually a series of illegal drainage pipes and embezzled maintenance funds, all held together by her iron-fisted bullying. By Wednesday evening, a special meeting was called. Not by Mandy, but by a coalition of angry neighbors led by Henderson, the treasurer, who was trying to save his own skin. They didn't meet in the community center this time. They met on the sidewalk right outside my gate. "Brian," Henderson called out, looking haggard. "We've seen the audit. Mandy's been using the reserve fund as her personal legal war chest for years. The association is technically insolvent. If we don't settle your claim and fix those pipes, we're looking at a total collapse." I stood at my gate, leaning on the post, old man Miller had probably notched 1,000 times. I felt a strange surge of pity for them. They were still trapped in the hell I'd just escaped. They were looking at a special assessment of $5,000 per household just to cover the mess Mandy had made. "The settlement is signed, Henderson," I said, my voice calm. "I've granted the easement. You fix the pipes, you pay my lawyer, and we're square. But if I were you, I'd be looking at the bylaws for a dissolution clause." The word dissolution hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a homeowner in the U.S., an HOA is a permanent cage, but there is often a self-destruct button hidden in the fine print, usually requiring an 80% vote of the entire membership. "She's resigned!" someone yelled from the back of the crowd. "Mandy sold her Lexus this morning. She's putting her house on the market." I looked toward the end of the cul-de-sac. Mandy's mansion, the seat of her 20-year empire, looked cold and abandoned. She wasn't just a Karen anymore, she was a pariah. She'd tried to recruit me into her hell, but in the end, she was the only one who couldn't live in the neighborhood she'd created. "We're voting tonight," Henderson said, his voice trembling. "Not for a new president. We're voting to abolish the association." I watched them march down the street toward the park, a mob of people finally realizing that property values aren't worth the price of your soul. I turned back to my workshop, the smell of cedar and victory filling my lungs. I was the only one on the block who didn't have to vote. I was already free. The special meeting lasted until nearly midnight, but I didn't need to be there to hear the result. The roar of approval that drifted over my fence line told the story. The Oak Creek Estates HOA had been dissolved by a landslide 92% vote. The recruitment to hell had ended in a total systemic collapse. I was back at Miller's workbench, cleaning the last of the linseed oil off my hands, when I noticed a strange shim in the heavy oak leg of the bench itself. It wasn't just a wedge, it was a carved plug of dark mahogany, out of place against the light oak. I pried it loose with a thin chisel, and a small, tarnished brass key slid into my palm. The key fit a locked floor safe I'd found under a pile of rusted clippers on my first day. Inside wasn't gold or cash. It was a single notarized indemnity bond from 1983, backed by a defunct insurance carrier, but assigned to the owner of Outlot A. I realized then that Miller's final middle finger wasn't just for Mandy. It was for the bank that had funded the original subdivision. The bond stated that if the drainage system, the one Mandy had trespassed with, ever failed or caused a loss of property value, the master title holder, the bank, was liable for the full restoration of the entire neighborhood's land. The next morning, as Henderson and a group of panicked neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, staring at a massive sinkhole that had just opened up near the cul-de-sac's main pipe, I walked out with the bond in my hand. "Mandy's gone, and the HOA is broke," Henderson moaned, looking at the water gushing into the hole. "We're going to have to pay for this ourselves, thousands per house. We're ruined." "Not exactly," I said, handing him the bond. "Miller bought this insurance 40 years ago. It's a covenant of indemnity. It stays with this dirt, and it forces the founding bank to cover the failure of infrastructure for the entire subdivision, not just my lot." The look on Henderson's face was better than any settlement check. The old man hadn't just protected his own workshop. He'd built a dead man's switch that would save the very neighbors who had spent decades trying to tear him down. By keeping his land sovereign, he'd kept the insurance policy alive. By that afternoon, the bank's lawyers were on site, and the special assessment notices were being torn up. The neighborhood wasn't a manicured estates anymore. It was just a street. People started painting their front doors red, blue, and yellow. One guy, 3 houses down, even started building a chicken coop in his front yard. I sat on the finished oak bench on my porch, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that finally looked like a community instead of a corporation. I saw Mandy's for sale sign being hammered into her lawn by a bored-looking contractor. She was leaving a world she no longer understood, fleeing a place where she couldn't control the wattage of a light bulb. I stood up, walked into the workshop, and turned on the heavy Laguna bandsaw. The high-pitched whine was music to my ears, the sovereign sound of a man who owned his dirt, his air, and his future. I picked up a piece of scrap pine and started carving a small sign for my gate. It didn't say welcome, it just said Miller's Land. And that's my story. Thanks so much for listening. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate you giving the video a like and the channel a subscribe. And if you want more HOA stories like this, drop a comment below and let me know what kind of stories you'd like to hear. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll hopefully catch you next time.